Hello everybody, welcome back to American Textbook Reading. I'm your host Brian Stuart. We're going to be continuing our theme of Earth Science, and we're going to cover Lesson 8, How Does Earth Change? So how does the Earth change? In this lesson, you will discover the weather can change the features of the Earth in many ways. So that's an interesting point. We're going to be focusing on the weather. So we'll talk about different conditions of the weather and how can it change the features of the Earth, But the main point is we're going to be talking about the weather. So every day, we might see the sun is very hot today, or it might be raining a lot today, or the wind is really blowing. But we don't really think about how the weather is changing the Earth around us. But in this lesson, we'll take a special look at that process, which is important. And this process happens over a very long time, which is probably why we don't really pay attention to it much, unless in certain circumstances, when it happens, there's a very severe weather. Then we notice big changes very quickly. One of those big changes, of course, is a flood. When it rains a lot, right? It rains a lot, the rivers, lakes, and other bodies of water will get so much water they'll come up and they will flood the surrounding areas. Sometimes we see that probably where you live in the summer months. When it rains a lot, sometimes the rivers and lakes will come up and there will be water everywhere. In people's homes, unfortunately, on streets. As you can see, it might come up to where cars are usually driving. So a flood happens when it rains a lot. Lots and lots of rain. And the rivers and the streams overflow. They flow over their banks. Okay, so if you live in a city where it has a river running through it, or that's near a river or streams, it rains a lot, especially during the summer months, those rivers will get too big and they'll come over, they will overflow their banks and flow into your town or into your city, and that's a flood. Now, the opposite of a flood is when it doesn't rain at all, right? A long period of time when there is little or no rain. Yeah, as you can see in the picture, we call this, of course, a desert, right? There's little or no rain here, and you can see the ground. Look at the ground. It's so dry that the ground has become cracked and it's curving up because, this is mud, and mud is usually wet and moist and it's soft and it's all flat. But when there's no water, it dries and it curls up and it cracks like this. And we can see just by looking at this picture that there is no water in this ground. And that's what happens because the land gets very, very dry. We can take a look at a picture, a better video of this type of environment. Okay, as we can see, this is a place where there has been a drought for a long time. Now, we can see water in the background. It looks a little bit wet way back here. Maybe this water comes up in the rainy season, but in the dry season, it hasn't rained for a really long time. So all the water has probably evaporated and it's retreated. It's gone down to this very small part here. And most of the rest of the land, there's little or no water at all. There's no water here. It hasn't rained for such a long time that this land has dried out and it's become cracked because it's so dry in this area. Okay, and as I just said, I use that word crack because we saw some examples of that, right? When you look at the land like this here and you see many cracks, we call these openings, an opening in the ground, we call them cracks. Now, a lot of these cracks are made because the land is dry. A crack is made when the land is dry. There's no water here. Because water is kind of like a glue, really, that holds soil and earth and ground together. When there's no water, that glue kind of breaks up, right? And the land separates, right? And that's what creates cracks. And it's very obvious also in the previous pictures when the mud gets so dry, right? That water's gone, so then the mud separates. It gets dry, it starts to curve up, and there's a lot of cracks. Now this is in rock, so it could be because there's no water, or it could just be because the rock is very hard. There's other reasons why ground cracks, not just because of dryness, but other impacts. Like an impact could crack the land. If the land is shifting or moving, that could also crack the land, but we call these things cracks. These openings between these spaces between the rock on the surface. Those are cracks. Okay. Now, what we can also use another word to describe this process, right? We're talking about how the weather changes the features of the land. Now, over a long time, we can call that weathering. Weathering. That's kind of a long word. It starts with w, weathering. It's weathering. We can say that that is a process. That is the process of the weather changing the environment. The breakdown of rocks by the action of rain, snow, wind, etc. And when we talk about weathering, sure, it's a change, but it's usually a destructive change. It's not a change for improvement. It's a change that destroys something. It destroys the rocks. It destroys the environment, because a lot of rain will fall. The rain will pick away at the rocks little by little. Wind will come by, and wind, over a long time, hundreds, thousands, millions of years, will start to carry off pieces of rocks. It will shape the rocks. And of course, snow, when snow falls down, both the weight and the cold also will act to destroy the rocks. Now, by the way, weathering is also a common word used to describe what the weather does to your house, right? So if you talk about the weathering on your house, you're also talking about the destructive action that the weather has on your house. It might create stains on the side of your house. It might show your paint on the outside of your house, might show cracks. We call that weathering. So it's not just about rocks, but it can also be about just about anything that is kind of destroyed by the destructive forces of the weather through rain, snow, and wind. Okay. Now, another special or specific type of weathering, we call that erosion. Erosion is when rocks and soil are moved by wind or water to a new place. So where weathering kind of makes cracks and destroys rocks a little bit, a specific part of erosion or of weathering is erosion, and that's when rocks will actually move from one place to another. If you take a look at this picture here, you can see a river at the bottom of a valley or canyon. You see these rocks here. There's two forces acting on these rocks. The first force we can talk about is the water. Probably a long time ago, maybe millions of years ago, tens of thousands or millions of years ago, this land was flat. The water came by, and the water dug into the ground, and it carried that ground away and downstream. So the water moved the rock, and it kept digging down into the earth. Now, after that happened, then the wind comes along. When the wind's moving over the flat plain, everything's, it's just picking up the grass. But now the wind has a canyon or walls to go around, and this wind can get very strong. And as the wind goes around, it will carry away pieces of the rock, and it will actually carve the rock. You might not think about it because it takes a very, very long time for wind to shape rock. But you get some very interesting shapes with the wind, and the wind will also smooth out the rock, right? It's kind of like sandpaper going on the rock for thousands and thousands, and in some cases millions of years, and shaping the rock into different shapes. And we call that erosion, because basically the rocks are being moved. First, the rocks are being moved downstream, and second, the wind is blowing the rocks off the face of the cliff and down and kind of smoothing out the sides of the cliff. So that's what's going on. Erosion, when rocks and soil are moved by wind or water to a new place. Okay, now we can also talk about this verb here, to dig, and this is something that people do. Animals do this too. If you have a dog and you have a yard, you might look at your dog and your dog's digging around in the ground in your backyard. To dig. To dig just means to move soil, and this would be soil, right, ground, from one place to another. So if you use a shovel and you dig, you're moving that soil or ground from one place and you're putting it into another place. So to dig means to move soil from one place to another. Usually human beings and animals will dig, but water, as we saw in the previous slide, water can also dig into the ground. Okay? Now, to break, we talked about break, right? Weathering is kind of like a breaking down of the rocks, right? To break means to separate into many different pieces. Oh no, looks like somebody's piggy bank got broken. But maybe this isn't a bad thing, right? Maybe whoever owns this piggy bank took a hammer and They broke it because they want the money. Maybe they're going to buy a present for somebody, their sister or their brother. It's their birthday coming up soon. They need some money, so they break the piggy bank and they get the money out of it. Do you have a piggy bank at home? Well, if you do, you might one day break your piggy bank. Of course, many piggy banks are made of plastic. They have the little cap on the bottom, so this is a little bit dangerous actually. But anyway, this is what happens when something breaks, right? It separates into many different pieces. It was one whole thing before, it breaks apart, now you have many different pieces. That's exactly what's going on when we're talking about weather changing rocks, right? The weather is breaking that whole rock into several different pieces. Erosion is moving pieces of that rock from one place to another. Okay, isn't that sweet? We have a heart-shaped pile of dirt. That's very sweet. Okay, so this is shaped as a heart, right? Okay, but this is dirt. When we talk about dirt, we've talked about soil a lot already in the lessons, right? But there's a lot of different words that mean the same thing as soil, and dirt is one of them, right? We can call it ground, we can call it soil, we can call it dirt, earth or soil. By the way, of course, you're probably familiar with the adjective dirty, right? Dirty, of course, comes from dirt, because if you go out and you play in the dirt all day long, you come back home, you've got dirt on your clothes, you've got dirt on your hands, your mother says, you are dirty, right? Go clean up, right? So, of course, dirt makes people dirty, but dirt is also important for us, right? Of course, especially in soil. This looks like good dirt because this is good dirt to grow plants in. Okay? So dirt isn't always something to avoid. Sometimes dirt is a good thing. And when it's shaped like a heart, okay, who can resist good dirt? Okay. Okay, let's move on. We have a nice chart here to kind of review some of the words that we've learned so far in this lesson. We're talking, of course, about different weather conditions and how they change the earth. How does the earth change? Well, first of all, we can see in this picture here that there's a lot of water covering the land. Now, these are trees growing. Trees don't usually grow in water like this, so we can see that this is a temporary situation. It's a flood. There's a river somewhere that usually flows through this area, but there's so much water that we can't see where the river normally goes. There's so much water that the river got so big, it flooded, it overflowed into the surrounding area, and all the water's covering the entire area. And that's when we call that a flood. Over here is the opposite of a flood. Not a lot of rain. So when there's not a lot of rain, we call that a drought, right? And when there's not a lot of rain, the ground will crack, dry out, and start to form cracks. And we learned that word crack. Let's take a look at a video of an area that's been affected by a drought. Okay, this area has obviously been affected by a drought. There has been no rain going on in here. Wow, it's very dry and hot, isn't it? Whew, I think I need some water. Whew. If you go into this area, make sure you bring a lot of water with you if you ever go hiking in an area that's been affected by a drought, because there's no water. It hasn't rained for a long time. Look at this tree. This tree's dead. It hasn't had any water. Trees need water to survive. So this drought has been going on for a long time. Look at the land. It's dry, it's cracked. Nothing is growing here. Plants need water to survive. Without water in an area that has been hit by drought, there are no plants. And even the plants that were there before, they will die. And unfortunately, you will too if you don't bring water. So don't stay here long, and if you come here, bring plenty of water with you. Okay, coming back to our chart here, we've seen the drought. Let's move on to weathering. Okay, as we saw before, the weathering, it's a kind of a picture here. We can see the tree. This is the root of the tree. A rock used to be surrounding that. The rock used to be over that. But because of weather, rain, snow, maybe wind, but I would say more rain and snow, has broken this rock away from the tree. Now that's dangerous for the tree, right? Because before the rock was supporting that tree, but now the roots of the tree are exposed. Because what we have here is a process called weathering, and that's broken the rocks down. Okay, so that would be weathering. Over here we have erosion. We've talked about this picture before. Again, remember, erosion is when water or air move rocks from one place to another. We do have a video to look at here. Let's take a look at that. And here we have, of course, the starting shot is just a piece of rock. This doesn't look very interesting. Wow, look at that. That's pretty neat, huh? Okay, what we've got going on here is a good example of the water. Look at the water. You can see the water moving, and you can see the wind moving across the top. These are the two forces that really cause erosion. We have the water carving its way down through this land, through this earth. It's carving, it's digging down into this land and creating a shape here, right? Water will move in the path of least resistance, and it's not always a straight line, right? In this case, the water is really going around in a roundabout way, but we could see the water flowing from here down and around over this way, and it's carved out an interesting shape in the plains here, in the rock. Now, the other thing we saw was the wind was moving along this way. The wind, of course, will move across the top. Sometimes the wind will dip down around here, and it'll carve the rock into different shapes. Usually what happens is if you look at this rock here on this side and over on this side, it's very smooth. If you ran your hand over it, it would be very smooth. And that's mostly because the wind has been carving or polishing that rock over thousands and millions of years. And that's also the part of the process what we call erosion, because it's been eroding, slowly eroding this rock into the shape, into the condition that you see now. And it's very beautiful in many places also, these two forces. Okay, let's go over an exercise to review the words that we've learned so far. We're going to talk about the different definitions, right? And we have different words up at the top. The different words are drought, flood, dig, crack, erosion, and weathering. Our first definition, number 1, a long period of time when there is little or no rain. So you have a very long period of time, little or no rain. Remember the picture of the desert, right, with the dead tree. What do we call that area? That area has been hit by what? That area has been hit by a drought. Not by a flood, right? These are opposites. Not by a dig, not by a crack, not by an erosion, not by weathering. It's been hit by a drought. That is a drought. Number 2, our definition. To move soil. If you move soil from one place and you put it in another place, what are you doing? That's, of course, a verb, to do something. So which ones of these are verbs? Drought and flood are both nouns. Dig is a verb. Crack is a noun. Erosion is a noun. And weathering is a noun. The only verb we have is dig. So dig is our correct answer. To move soil from one place and put it in another, that is to dig. You're moving the soil from here, you're putting it in another place, to dig. Our third definition here, when the rock and soil are moved by wind or water to a new place. Okay? And this is a process. We're describing a process here. Now, it's a type of weathering, but more specifically, it is erosion. Erosion is a type of weathering, but specifically, erosion is when rock and soil are moved by the wind and water, those two forces that we saw in the video that are shaping the earth. They're moving that earth from one place to another by wind and by water, and we call that erosion. That is the process of erosion. Okay, let's take a look at 4, 5, and 6. The breakdown of rocks by the action of rain, snow, wind, etc. So we're talking about the destructive force. When you're breaking rocks apart. Of course, erosion does that, but erosion kind of, moves rocks from one place to another. This process can just be breaking the rocks apart, not really moving them around a lot. And what we call that, of course, is weathering. That's weathering. When the weather, the rain, the snow, the wind will break a rock apart into smaller pieces, we call that weathering. Okay, number 5, when it rains a lot. Really a lot of rain. So much rain that all that water fills up the rivers and the streams, and those rivers and streams, they overflow. And water is everywhere. What do we call that? We call that, of course, a flood. Okay? Unfortunately, that happens a lot of times in areas where there are rivers. If your city or town has a river running through it or by it, you might experience floods from time to time, especially in the summertime. Our last definition, number 6, an opening in the ground, which is made when the land is dry. it's not just made when the land is dry, but this is one of the common causes. It's an opening, remember, a space that opens up in the ground, especially when the land is dry, there's no water to hold the land together. The water goes away, the land separates. Okay? We call that, of course, crack. It's an opening. Many openings. There are many cracks in the ground. And we saw many good pictures of that happening in areas of drought. Okay. We have here several pictures, and what we have is a question. We need to answer the question here. The question is, what caused the conditions, right? We have different conditions in each of these pictures. What caused these conditions? Under each picture, we have a choice, A or B, A or B, A or B, and of course, these have to go with each picture. The choices are the same for each picture. Basically, what we're talking about is A is heavy rains all across, and B is dry days all across. So we have to look at the pictures and figure out which of these two things happened to cause these conditions. So what caused this condition? Flooding. What causes flooding? A lot of rain. Heavy rains will cause flooding. Okay, so we've got that one. Over here, this is the opposite of a flood. This is a drought, right? The land is dry, it's cracked. There's very little or no water in this ground. So what causes that? Obviously, heavy rains doesn't cause a drought because there's no water. Dry days will cause a drought. Dry days, no moisture, no water. Over here, this is a little bit difficult to look at. What we have here in a picture is not difficult to look at, it's difficult to figure out what's going on, but I'll explain it. What we have here is a small stream. Now, we can see that this stream used to be larger because there's a lot of dry, bare earth over here that indicates that probably this area was underwater usually. This area is usually underwater. This stream is probably usually a river, right? We can see the bank of the river here, you know, that's higher, so the water probably goes up to there. But if the water's up there, it will cover this area too. Plants don't really grow in water. So what I think is going on here is the water has evaporated. This river, which used to be wide, is now very narrow and has become a stream. So what would cause that? Would heavy rains cause that? No, because heavy rains would cause this stream to grow back to where it used to be. It might even cause it to flood. But the opposite is going on here. It hasn't rained. It's been very dry days for a long time, so the amount of water has shrunk, and this river has become a stream. So what would cause that? Of course, dry days. Okay, let's go over our true-false questions. We have circle T for true, circle F for false. Our first sentence, a flood is an opening in the ground. A flood is an opening in the ground? That doesn't make sense, obviously. That's false. Why? Because if you think about it, if there's an opening in the ground, the water would go into the opening, no more water, no more flood, right? So that's kind of a silly sentence, right? A flood is an opening in the ground. Doesn't make sense. A flood is when there's too much water and it overflows the river or streams. There's no opening. If there was an opening in the ground, the water would go into it and go away, but there's no opening. So if we changed flood to crack, that would make sense. A crack is an opening in the ground. That would make sense. That is correct. Okay, so let's move on to number 2. Weathering. Weathering, we talked about that process of weathering, happens by the action of rain, snow, and wind, etc. So actually that's true, right? Because we're talking about weathering. Weathering is the breaking down of rocks, right? What causes rocks to break down into smaller pieces? Lots of rain, lots of snow, and wind over a long period of time. That process is called weathering. Okay, number 3, erosion, which is a type of weathering. Erosion happens when soil moves water. Okay, so what this sentence is saying is that soil is moving, and when it moves, it makes water move with it. Does that make sense? Does that sound right to you? Does soil normally move? No. Water usually moves, right? So actually what happened in this sentence, they're trying to trick you because they switched soil and water around. If we just switch these two words, then it would be true. But right now it's false, right? Okay, so right now it's false because if we said erosion happens when water moves soil, okay, that's true. Because when water moves soil or rock, we call that erosion. It moves it away out of the area. That's erosion. And that's what happens. But what they're doing is they're trying to trick you, because soil doesn't normally move. Water normally moves in a river or a stream. But soil normally moves? No, soil normally stays put unless wind or water pushes it out of its place. So that's a kind of a tricky sentence. Okay, well that about wraps it up for the vocabulary part. Let's take a short break and then we'll come back and take a look at the reading section. See you soon. Okay, welcome back. We're going to go over the reading section and take a look at some of the words that we've just learned about. And of course, the subject that we're talking about is how does the earth change from the weather? How does the weather make the earth change? We can see the topic sentence. The weather can change the earth in many ways. Again, a good topic sentence. It's general, right? It's saying that our topic, our subject, we're talking about how the weather changes the earth, and our controlling idea is many ways. There are many different ways that the weather can change the earth. Of course, the rest of the passage will give us details about what those ways are. The first way, if it rains too much, it can flood. Right? So one way that the weather can change is that if it rains so much, there's a flood and the earth is covered with water. If there's too much water in the rivers and streams, water can flow onto the land and make life very, very difficult for the people in the area, as you can see here. This poor person who has a home, they have a lot of water, probably this much water flowing through their home right now, right? They've got a lot of water going through their home, and that's too bad. It's caused by a flood, too much rain. Now the opposite situation, in the opposite situation, when there's no rain, we have what we call a drought. A drought happens if there is no rain. The land gets very dry. Sometimes it cracks, especially if the land has mud or clay on the top, it will crack and it will buckle up. So you can see it's very interesting. A drought is too much rain. A flood is too much rain. A flood is too much rain. A drought is not enough rain. Of course, where do we want to live? We want to live in between, don't we? It would be nice if nature was always steady, right in between those two extremes. But of course, that's not the way that weather works. We either have floods or we have droughts. Some places on Earth we can find places that are usually in the middle most of the time, but not always, right? Sometimes we get too much rain, sometimes we don't get enough rain. And these are the two different situations that can happen. Okay, we can also talk about weathering. Weathering is the process that breaks rocks down. Weathering can also change the land. Weathering happens when rocks break and change. As you can see, this tree was growing here. Probably these rocks were surrounding it, but the weather, the wind, and the snow probably broke these rocks apart. Actually, to tell you the truth, I think this tree may have had something to do with it too, because as the tree grows, it expands. It also helps that weathering process to break the rock out. But, especially when we talk about rain and snow, they will help to break the rocks down, break the rocks apart. Okay. A special type of weathering is called erosion. Okay? Erosion happens when wind or water moves rocks and dirt. Remember, there's two forces, wind and water. So first what happened was the water came through and dug down into the earth. Then the wind was able to come along the sides of the canyon, of the valley here, and just also knock off some of the rocks and also carve the rocks, polish those rocks. So it takes takes the rough edges off the walls of the canyon here. So erosion happens when wind or water moves rocks and dirt. To prevent erosion, you can dig the earth and plant a tree. So that's an interesting sentence right there. If you want to prevent erosion, if you want to prevent that water from taking soil, valuable soil or valuable dirt that you need to grow your plants in, what you can do is you can dig into that soil, you can plant a tree. What will happen there is mostly the tree will stop the wind action from carrying away the top layer of soil. That's a very important point. And we can see that going on in different parts of the world. That's the most important thing that you can do to plant a tree. But trees will also soak up water, right? So the water won't run so quickly over the ground. Instead, the trees will stop that water, especially the roots, and they'll drink up that water. So not as much water will go through the area. So to prevent erosion, we can plant trees, and that's a good idea. It's a good natural way to prevent erosion. The land can change quickly or slowly, usually slowly, right? Not very often that it changes quickly, but it can change quickly in the case of a flood. Those are very quick. But over time, over a long period of time, especially when we're talking about wind, these walls of the canyon were not formed quickly. These walls of the canyon were formed over many, 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 many human lifetimes. No human being alive today saw this when the river was flowing on the top. Those people who saw that, if there were people there at the time, they are long, long, long dead, right? They're gone. Nobody remembers them thousands of years ago. Okay, so this is a process that takes place over a very, very long time. A lot of this weathering and erosion takes place over a very, very long time. The shape of the land is always changing. We don't see it because we only live, what? We only live 50, 60, 70, maybe if we're lucky, 100 years, which is not a lot of time, really, when we talk about the age of the earth. It's very, very short time. We're here for a very short time. We don't see always the land, how it's changing. If we lived for thousands of years, then we would probably notice more how the earth is changing from the weather. But it's always going on. Rain, wind, and ice are always changing the earth. They can all make the land change. Of course, this process takes a very, very long time. Weathering and erosion, they do take a long time to change the earth and make these beautiful landscapes that we can see and enjoy today. Okay. Let's go over a reading skill. The reading skill is classify. So we're talking about what are the forces that change the shape of the earth. What changes the shape of the earth? We can talk about these forces and then we can describe what they are. So here we have the definitions and then we have what they actually are. We're classifying them, we're naming them, we're labeling them. Okay, first of all, we have the definition. It rains too much. Now here are words down here: drought, weathering, flood, erosion. So which word goes with this definition? When it rains too much, what happens? Well, too much rain will cause a flood, okay? The rivers will overflow, the streams will overflow, water will be everywhere. We call that a flood. Now, the next situation, there is no rain. So there's no rain. It hasn't rained for a long time, very long time. Trees will die, plants will die. Plants will disappear. It's just dirt, and the dirt is so dry that it starts to crack, right? That water that was holding it together on a nice smooth surface, it's all gone. That glue is gone, so that the earth tries to, it buckles up. It starts to curve and it starts to crack. Of course, that condition is known as a drought. This area has been hit with a drought, or there is a drought in this area. The next situation, when wind or water moves rocks and dirt. And the two forces again, wind and water, they move. They take rocks from one place, and not just rocks, but also dirt, right? Soil, or little pieces of rocks on the top layer. It will move those rocks and dirt away. Dirt is non-count, don't say dirts. So move rocks and dirt away. What do we call that process? Of course, we call that process erosion. Erosion. Okay, our last force that we're talking about that changes the shape of the earth. When rocks break and change, rocks will break apart and they'll change their shape. That process over a long period of time is called weathering. Weathering involves rain, snow, and wind. It will break the rocks apart, make them change their shapes. Okay, so we have lots of different forces. These are our forces here: flood, drought, erosion, weathering, and these are our descriptions of what these things are. We have classified the forces that change the shape of the earth. Okay, let's do some reading comprehension questions. The first one, what can happen if there is no rain for a long time? So there's no rain, it's very, very dry in an area for a long time. What can happen what can happen? What results from that situation? A flood, a drought, or overflow? Well, flood and overflow are related, right? If there's too much rain, you have a flood. A flood is caused when the water overflows a river or stream. So our answer, of course, is B, drought, because there's no rain. If we have a lot of rain, we have a flood, we have overflows, but if there's no rain, then we have a drought. Okay, let's move on to number 2. Weathering happens when rocks, what? A, flow onto land. Rocks flow onto land. Rocks move like water over land? That doesn't make sense. Rocks stay put. They don't flow over the land. Well, they do, but over a very, very long time. Okay. B, are moved by water. Weathering happens when rocks are moved by water. That's erosion, okay? C, weathering happens when rocks break and change. Okay, from our reading, that's the correct answer, right? Because weathering is a special type of force that breaks rocks apart, okay? And that's what we're talking about. Breaks them apart, changes their shape, changes the way that they are put together or held together. Erosion, yeah, erosion is a type of weathering, but erosion really moves rocks and dirt from one place to another. Sometimes, in some cases, it moves it very far away from its original position. Okay, number 3. Rain, wind, and ice can all do what? A, slowly make a flood happen. B, change the shape of the land. C, stop weathering from happening. Okay, let's go over these. Slowly make a flood happen. Floods are not slow. Floods happen quickly, especially in the time when we're talking about the relative time of the earth. Floods are very quick. They happen, then they go away. Sure, it may seem like a long time if you're in a flood and you have to wait for the waters to go away, but really it's just a short time when we consider the age of the earth. So this is not true. A is not true. B, rain, wind, and ice can change the shape of the land. Sure, we saw that. We saw that from weathering, and we especially saw that with erosion, right? These things can change the shape of the land. Rain and wind can cause water to create erosion. Wind shapes the rocks. Ice can freeze the rock, and then when the ice melts, it can expand the rock and crack it, so the rocks are broken apart. That's part of weathering, so it can change the shape of the land. These things, that's the right answer. But number C, let's just take a look at that. These things can stop weathering? Doesn't make sense, because these things are part of weathering. Okay, so that wouldn't make sense. Rain, wind, and ice are parts of weathering. They are components of weathering, so they don't stop weathering from happening. That wouldn't make sense. Our right answer is B. Moving on to number 4, you can help stop erosion. How can we stop erosion? Because erosion usually is bad. We don't want our valuable soil, especially if we're growing plants here, we don't want that to be blown away. We don't want that to go away if there's a flood and the water takes it away. Farmers need soil. They need the topsoil of their land to have productive land, to grow plants, okay? We need that stuff. So we want to stop erosion, but how can we stop erosion? Well, one way that we can stop erosion is by digging into the earth and planting trees. As I said before, if you plant a tree, that will, first of all, it will stop the wind from moving so strongly, right? It will break the wind apart. It will help keep the soil in place. Also, it will soak up water, and it might help alleviate or might help prevent the water from carrying your soil away. Let's just look at B and C for practice. You can help stop erosion by digging the earth and weathering rocks. Doesn't make any sense. How can we weather rocks? That doesn't make any sense. C, moving rocks and dirt into cracks. That's an interesting idea. Oh, there's a lot of cracks in the ground. Let's just move some dirt into those cracks and cover those cracks up. That's not going to help anything, right? That's not really a good way to stop erosion because the wind will pick up that dirt out of the cracks. When you go home and go to sleep, there's a strong wind that night, all that dirt is going to be blown out of the cracks. So the best way, of course, is A, digging into the earth and planting trees. Plant a tree. Help out the environment. Stop erosion. Okay, we've come back to the chart that we saw before. We have our pictures here, and these pictures all show different forces about how does the earth change. These are different ways that the earth changes. Let's go over them in turn. Do you remember? If you remember, I'll describe the pictures. You guys guess which word to use to label these forces that change the earth. First of all, we have an area here. It's covered by water. Where the river used to be, there was probably a river flowing through here. It probably rained a lot, and there's so much water that the water overflowed, went over the area of the river and flowed out into the surrounding land. What do we call that situation? What do we call that condition? We call that, of course, a flood. Now over here, coming over here, we have the opposite of a flood. What is the opposite of a flood? Remember, we have the two extremes, and I'll spell that word out for you right now. Extremes. We talked about that a little bit before. I mean, these are extremes in the weather. Flood is one extreme. On the other side is drought. These are two extremes. So over here, we have the opposite of a flood. There's no rain. Hasn't rained for a long time. This ground is very, very dry. Okay, there's no water here. The earth has begun to crack. What do we call this condition? We call this condition a drought. Okay, no water. Okay, let's move down here to this picture here. Now we can see that the rocks have been breaking apart. The rocks have been broken apart by some forces. Usually rain, snow, wind will break rocks apart and change their shape and, make them from big rocks into little rocks. What do we call that? What is that process called? That process is called weathering, right? Anytime, and it's a destructive force. Remember that. It's a destructive force. It breaks things apart. It's not just rocks. Remember, I also told you that weathering also happens to your house. It happens to your car, right? Anytime the weather helps break down or destroy an object, then we call that weathering. Now, a type of weathering also is shown in this picture, right? First of all, we have water that flows through the area and carries rocks and dirt from one place to another, but we also have wind. Strong winds will also cause a type of weathering known specifically as erosion. And that wind will carry rocks and dirt away to a place far away. To prevent erosion, if we plant trees, that will prevent the wind, first of all. It will prevent the wind from coming through. It will also soak up a lot of the water, okay? And maybe change the weather patterns in the area as well. But if we plant a tree, we can help to prevent erosion. Okay, so we've covered this lesson, lesson 8. How does the earth change? You may not realize it, but the earth is changing all the time. The weather is changing the earth very, very slowly. And we don't realize it because we're not on the earth for a very long time. But if we lived for thousands of years, we could see really big changes in the earth because of the weather. Okay, well, that's kind of an interesting lesson. We'll wrap it up here. Hope you've learned a lot, as usual. We'll see you next time, everybody. Take care.